Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be the ultimate truth.
Hey, everybody, we are back. Another week goes flying by here. It's Rick Wagner getting it right here, and the ANZZ and KGLN at Getting It Right with Rick Wagner. It's kind of a, it's a good coincidence like that. You can listen to us here on the radio. You can listen to us on the internet from pretty much anywhere you're at. And we have our podcast up. That's a good way to catch up with the show if you'd like, and you can get it off, most of these services like, I think Spotify and maybe Apple and things like that. I haven't really checked it out, but it's supposed to be pretty easy. You just ask for the Rick Wagner Show, and if it's on, they'll find it. If it's not, they'll say, who? So there you'll know. Anyway, so another week, and hope everybody's doing well out there. It's kind of turning to spring where I'm at here, as many of you know, and it's a fight, as usual. In Colorado, there's this struggle where you have one day where it seems like it's just almost summer, and the next day it's like kind of winter. And, it's a little hard to predict. I just, we had a really warm day, and then a couple days later it was snowing. So there you go. At least it gives some variation to it. And nobody's kind of going crazy with the weather either. I don't know if you've been following this story, by the way, down in Antarctica. But it just kind of caught my eye. But the South Africans have a team down in a base down there. And the base is pretty interesting looking. It sort of looks like two trains stacked on each other. Like if you took like 8 or 9 box cars and stacked them one on top of the other and then kind of separated them a little bit. So it looks like kind of a very strange, cheap apartment house. Yeah. And except it's in Antarctica. And it's got scientific stuff and apparently some places to keep you amused and things like that because it's not a great place to take a walk in the evening, So it's probably, you got to kind of stay in, especially now. Because remember, Antarctica, the seasons are opposite. So as it's coming into March, it's coming into the winter down there, where there will be many hours of darkness and cold. And some people don't adjust well to that. And apparently they've got at least one member of this crew down there from South Africa that they have heard from other crew members has pretty much went crazy and has been assaulting people and a few things like that. And they can't really get to them right now to get them out. It's a little bit like the astronauts there, except they're stranded on Earth. At some point, they're going to have to do something because this kind of isolation, weather isolation, things like that, you don't really know how people are going to respond very much until they do it. And Antarctica is very similar in some ways to space, except, the weightlessness, which is cool at first and then damaging as the time's lengthened out. But what you have is you have the same sort of isolation, the difficulty in returning to civilization, threat of something happening all the time. Because, if say the generator goes out up there and the heat kind of goes down, you don't have a lot of time outside with a screwdriver to get that thing working again before, you're a statue. So these kinds of things weigh on people's minds. So it's an interesting study. We'll see what happens when these people come back. And it's gotten to the point where it's a little like the space shuttle got, and a little bit like some of our ISIS, our International Space Station people, is that there are people going there that are not really, they're not really the old scientific type. Startup guys packing up their microscopes and their telescopes or whatever the case may be, going down there. There's like people who are, in different kinds of professions. It's sort of, hey, I'd like to be the first person who, is a green grocer to go to Antarctica or something. And so that creates its own system of problems. But it's an interesting and kind of scary phenomenon when you read about it. It sounds like a movie with this guy going on down there. You know about it because they've sent radio transmissions out. They can't really get into it right now. They know about this guy's, went off the deep end. And there's like, let me think, like 9 people there, I think. And One maniac. So that's not a great ratio. And we know about it. Like I said, it sounds like a horror movie, like someone would write this up and you think, oh, that wouldn't happen. They'd get them out of there. Well, we're still not masters of nature yet. There are things in nature that we still can't overcome, and some things in the weather that we can't overcome, despite what the people who believe the climate is changing because people are driving Suburbans, that kind of thing. Anyway, so let me check here. Yep, Donald Trump's still president, so that's pretty good. Things are going okay. The Ukrainians are trying to invade Russia again, and the Russians are pushing into the Ukraine. So that's something you don't see a lot. It's sort of is brought about whenever someone thinks there might be some sort of ceasefire or some sort of surcease to the war, because both sides, and how long has this been going on? Like, I don't know, all of human history. When they think something's going to come to an end or get stopped, each side tries to get as much ground, as much treasure, as much whatever it is as possible before that. Now, Ukrainians have kind of a weird philosophy here because, of course, they're in the defense. And their idea, and they did this before, like 6 months ago, where they decided they were going to invade Russia again. Now, I think Wednesday or Thursday, they launched some missiles at inside Russia at I think at a sort of a supply depot or something. This is all understandable. I mean, if you want to stop the enemy from driving into your country and doing things to you, you need to stop their ability to drive into your country or eat while they're there, or all these kinds of mundane things that are really at the center of warfare. Armies don't march hungry. Mechanized armies don't go places without fuel. People in really challenging climates, like the cold, don't do much unless they have the proper supplies. So the logistics piece of these things, particularly in these kinds of environments, are really key. I mean, we all know the old Napoleon saying that an army marches on its stomach. Yeah, that's true. It's just one of the things it marches on. The Romans figured this out. I mean, they had one of the most sophisticated supply trains really ever in terms of, what they had available to them. For a long time, they had that figured out. And anybody that studies warfare understands that. Patton understood that. People talk a lot about George Patton, about, his rush for the Battle of the Bulge and his amazing turn of the Third Army at 90 degrees and heading back in a different direction. Yeah, but if you really study that a little bit, you'll see that just prior to him making these sort of lightning decisions, he was putting out logistical supplies in the path that he was hoping to take, where they could catch things, where they could find things, where things would be. Not so far out that the enemy's going to get them, but constantly moving logistical support ahead. It moved ahead at the same pace or slightly greater pace in some instances than the armor. And for those of you that have been in the military, you know this better than I do. If you've been around about armor, even the new stuff, what does it require besides fuel? I mean, these diesels burn. It's gallons to the mile with those as opposed to miles to the gallon. So that's pretty. Of course, we're going to go all electric. I remember we're going to do that. We're going to have sort of, I don't know, sort of kind of like maybe like a race car engine in them, like you get on a little track. I don't know. That was their idea. These are people who know about as much about modern warfare as they know about human biology, apparently. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what happens with Ukraine. They're pushing in on one side into Russia to show that they can, to try and get the Russians to divert forces to try and stop them. The Russians, in the meantime, are just grinding out a good part of Ukraine on the other end of the country, trying to move in. And it's a strange situation. You don't see it very often that way in military conflicts. It just shows how kind of unusual this is. And both sides, but particularly the Ukrainians, take a real chance of being cut off. I mean, the Russians too, but they have a little more reserves. So, getting a flanking action and getting cut off in foreign territory, not as likely for them. Pretty dangerous for the Ukrainians. We'll see how it goes. We'll be back. Hey, everybody. Okay, second segment here. Now, I played as a bumper Johnny Horton's song, which I played before, The Battle of New Orleans. Now, those of you that hear the podcast won't get to hear that bumper, but you can look it up. It's great. It is, in fact, about the Battle of New Orleans. Andy Jackson was leading that. It was quite a good battle and a victory for the United States. Got some good terms in it, so we fired our guns, and the British kept coming. We fired them, although not as many as the time before. Fired our guns, and they began to running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, we know it's the Gulf of America now. But, yeah, and I have a reason for saying that. I had this down. I couldn't believe it. Joy Reid, who many of you should not know, was one of the hosts on MSNBC and one of the most deranged. And as is often the case with some of these people, they apparently have been to advanced education, some sorts. And yet, when pressed upon common knowledge, historical knowledge, economic knowledge, just pretty much anything, they seem to either not understand it or not know it. And so President Trump has been speaking about Canada as a 51st state, which is interesting. I can't tell how serious he is. Certainly, we could get along better with Canada, and we will when they stop imposing their tariffs on our imports and maybe do a little bit more tightening up about what comes across their border. Anyway, so of course, Joy Reid was fired from MSNBC because no one would watch her show. Really, nobody watches much of any show on that channel, and I don't really understand how they stay on, and certainly how they pay some of these hosts like Rachel Maddow, who's, by the way, it seems to be a carbon copy of Mark Cuban, if you want to see them together when Cuban's wearing his glasses. Anyway, so at this point, she was discussing with Don Lemon, the fired CNN anchor, who has just like her, has like no knowledge of things. I mean, they should demand their money back from whatever secondary education they went to. They should just say, look, I need my money back because I'm an idiot. And I'm probably going to spend all the money that the news gave me soon because I'm an economic idiot. And so I'll need a little extra money. I'd like to have that back because it did me no good whatsoever, right? So they're discussing this on it's a podcast. I guess it's a vlog because it's a video. And I saw the story about it. And Joy Reid had decided that we better be careful with Canada because we're not going to be able to get Canada as a 51st state unless we invade them. And the last time we tried that, it didn't go well for us. They beat us and they burnt Washington. All right. Now, many of you who have just read anything know about the War of 1812. And one of the funny questions we used to ask on one of these tests we give out was, what year was the War of 1812 fought? Anyway, you will know that we had another outbreak of a little argument with Great Britain in 1812 and had a number of little fights, and we did, in fact, move into Canada because we really couldn't get over to Britain and, fight in Wales at this point. Although we did burn York, which was at that point a sort of British outpost here in the United States. And so that was a battle that went back and forth for a while. And it's true that the British Navy did sail the Potomac and take Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. was pretty different then. It was barely built. It's still a swamp. I mean, remember, it was originally a swamp. That's why none of the states wanted it and were saying, hey, yeah, go ahead if you want to take that. So they gave it to Columbia. And at that point, the White House was there, the early Capitol building, and I think the Library of Congress. And the British commander burned them down in revenge for burning down York. Now, to my knowledge, and a little bit of research I did, the Canadian Army did not have anything to do with that. Canada, of course, at the time was part of Great Britain. We may remember this from the French and Indian Wars and all this other kind of stuff. No Canadian troops swarmed across the border, seized Washington, and burned it. So, Joy, you're a little off base there. You know, it's sort of like everything they think about. It's off kilter. But it was pretty funny to watch these two people talk about it for a minute. Neither one of them apparently knowing the subtleties of it at all. As a matter of fact, the War of 1812 ended a little after 1814. And it was, I think the Treaty of Ghent, it was called, G-H-E-N-T, was signed. And really, it was a stalemate. Neither side really had any progress. We burned some of their stuff, attacked some of them. They did the same to us. Although the Battle of New Orleans was pretty much decisive. In the one sense, it showed the British that they weren't going to get anywhere in the United States. That ship had sailed, even though they were in a little better position than they were in the Revolutionary War. They weren't quite as at war as many places and many things as they were in Revolutionary War, but we were a little stronger then as well. Plus, we were just tough. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Andrew Jackson was, he was a tough bird, man. And we still had the good fighters. We still had a lot of tactics that was hard for the British to kind of figure out because it was different than they fought in Europe. But yeah, I mean, the Canadians didn't beat us and burn the capital in 1814. And the fact that people were out there saying that and who are supposed to be educated in that way, it's funny. I'm sorry. It would be sad, except they're idiots, so it's funny. And watching them do it is sort of like, once again, it's a Dunning-Kruger effect. Remember the Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's the study that was done about why dumb people think they're smart, and how fascinating it is. The study, I mean, we've talked about this before. It kind of boils down, and it's a lot more subtle than this, but it kind of boils down to the fact that people that aren't particularly smart don't realize how much there is to know about a topic. So when they absorb some of this, they think that that's all there is. They're not really capable of like penetrating to see what else is going on or other questions and things like that. So they think they got it all. So they're very ready to decide that they're experts because in their mind, they know all there is to know about this topic, which of course is absurd. But they don't know that. So people with the Dunning-Kruger effect are much more likely to venture their opinions out there loudly. They're also much more likely to correct other people. Now, some of us correct others as well. You know, it's not a great habit. I find people don't like it as well as you might think. And then you get this idea that you're so smart that when people can't argue with you because you know all there is. So that's what happens to these sorts of people. And this, of course, is what's happened to Joy Reid, Don Lemon, 2 or 3 others. Some of them out there know the difference, and I think it makes it a little bit worse. Jake Tapper, for instance, I think he knows the difference of some of the stuff he says. It's just not convenient for him to say what is actually going on. I think some of the writers at the New York Times know the difference between what the truth is and what they write. But because it's so important to resist Donald Trump and everything that the conservatives are doing, that it's okay to sort of stretch the truth, sort of like, you know, getting some handy wrap there and just like stretching it across there. Yeah, that's okay because you're resisting, you're fighting you cast conservatives and Donald Trump into such a light that, of course, anything that you do to stop him is justifiable, even if it is, kind of wrong, So that's how they think about it. But it was like on a Friday that, DOGE with Elon Musk was going to go over to I think it might happen, to the Defense Department to start assisting in auditing their expenditures. Because the Defense Department has a terrible record of spending money, as you know. The New York Times wrote an article that had more writers in it than it did sources. Said that, they were going to brief Elon on the plans to go to war with China if that happened. And that was dangerous because Elon has interests in China and he might tell. First of all, that's not true at all. No one that knows anything had said that. And anybody that thinks about it is, why would they do that? That's not what DOGE is about anyway. And it seems very unlikely that that would happen, that Elon would want that. and that it would do anybody any good. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. They just want to throw it out there. And when you see that, you know, it's going on. It's sort of like that the new fighter that they announced at that press conference, the F-47. You know, the number 47 may sound familiar to you because, of course, President Trump's the 47th president, as he was the 45th. So he was kind of happy with the F-47. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to look. Right after that happened, I went and looked at 2 or 3 of these really far left websites and typed in, you know, the F-47 and the comments about it. They're just unhinged. It was really hilarious. I mean, it's sort of like, always remember when these guys get upset, it's sort of like setting a firecracker off in the middle of a chicken coop. That's what it's like. People flying everywhere, flying into the fence, flying out, you know, it's a terrible sign. We'll be back. Okay, we're back. We're going to do something that I like to do every so often, which is we're going to discuss a little bit of foreign policy and military history and military projection a little bit, I think. I asked my friend Ryan, International Man of Mystery, who is getting his master's degree in military history, if he has a minute to call in. So we'll see if he gets around to that on this subject, if he's able to do so. But we shall proceed, because I thought it was interesting. Let's talk about Panama. Panama. Yeah, there's a great song by, well, it's not a good song. I don't really care for it, but a lot of people like care for it by Van Halen. Anyway, so Panama, where did it come from? A lot of you people know, some of you do not. What we think of as the nation of Panama used to be part of Colombia. And there were some insurgents, as we would call them now, in Panama, that the area of Panama that wanted independence. Well, at the same time, the French had a contract with Colombia in there to try and build a canal, pretty much where it is now, in what we call Panama. They were not having a lot of luck. A guy by the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, they tried to build it. They tried to build it in a different way than we ended up building it a little bit, which was difficult. Some of their engineering choices were kind of poor, really. Look back on it. They spent way too much money. And the biggest thing was they had this tremendous loss of life. As many of you know, that is a very jungly, disease-prone part of the world, as many of these kind of areas are when you get in the equator and you get pretty much rainforests and stuff like that. What they were dying of was malaria and yellow fever. Now, these are mostly carried by mosquitoes. And they're very deadly. They wipe people out. Some people recover from the malaria. Some people are able to use quinine, which is where we get tonic water from. The British did that when they were in India because it also has the same problem with malaria. But it's not a cure. It assists someone in resisting the onslaught of malaria, at least, you know, as it was used then. So it was a very difficult time, and many people lost their lives trying to build this canal, French and eventually Americans. So they just couldn't get it done. We wanted it done, and we wanted it done in our favor. We had a president at that time, some of you may recall, was named Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had a tendency to be a man of action. And he saw this going down there, and he believed that the United States could build that canal, could do it and do it better than the French were attempting to do it. But we couldn't get a deal with the Panamanians. The French were kind of pulling out. There's just too much. Well, I should say the Colombians at the time. Well, as I said, there were some insurgents in this area that wanted to have their own country. Now, as luck would have it, the State Department for the United States, I would guess that's Hayes probably would have been the Secretary of State then, met with some of these insurgents, and they discussed this idea, and somehow they got Titty involved in it, and so what was decided was that the United States would assist these insurgent revolutionaries in forming their own country for a little financial assistance from us and military protection, and of course, allowing us to take over the canal building. So they signed a treaty, and let me see what the treaty was called. I wrote this down here because it's called the Hay. Okay, so Hay, so Hay was the Secretary of State then. The Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty. Now, legend has it, and I think this is correct, is that this was signed in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York with Teddy Roosevelt, these guys. I think Teddy was there, although I'd have to check that out. But in other words, we formed the country of Panama in the United States because we wanted to get the canal. Colombia wouldn't do it. Panamanian revolutionaries wanted to split off. We said, okay, say we help you. What are you going to do for us? Well, we helped them. Now, we helped them a couple of different ways. And there was no real input from the Colombian people, obviously. And there was no real input from some of the other organizations in Panama, some of the, more civilian ones, the non-revolutionary ones. So they were a little ticked off about that. But, you can only have so many cooks in the kitchen, right? So we did that diplomatically, but we also did it militarily. We dispatched gunboats down there and so forth because, Teddy didn't mess around. He still also believed that there was a little manifest destiny left in the United States, that we needed to improve our trade. The idea of being able to get from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean without going around Tierra del Fuego down there at the South America, which is a difficult passage. Pretty darn impressive. So we took over that canal and re-engineered it. We also did as much as possible to eradicate the mosquito population down there. And we were relatively pretty successful. We had a lot of people who perished from disease and so forth while this canal was being built, but nothing like the French. And a lot of accidents that happened too, as you might guess. And we had a different way of approaching this because we wanted to build it in a lock system. And you know what that is there is a ship sails in to a big square, well, it's a rectangle, built usually in a river, and then it's sealed off, and then water is pumped in, and the boat rises, and then there's water at a higher level in the next lock, and they open the gate at that end, and it sails in there. And slowly, like climbing a ladder, the ship gains enough height to get over the central part of Panama. There's a lake in there, too. Some of you may have been on a cruise ship that went across that. And then, of course, it goes back down. This is an amazing feat of engineering. And when it was done, it gave the United States an incredibly dominant position over trade in this hemisphere, which was exactly what we wanted. Because at that point in time, we didn't want to wouldn't appear to be like, oh, we're so sorry that we're so powerful and that we're so good and we do things. No, we weren't that way then. So we had really indirect control over Panama and direct control over the Panama Canal Zone. And for much of the 20th century, we had a real economic advantage and also geopolitical power that we could project across that. Now, of course, fast forward to the time of, is he a peaser or I don't know what? Jimmy Carter, 1977. They got together with this guy, Omar Torrijos, and they essentially decided they would transfer the canal control to Panama. Panama at this point had pretty much formed its own government. We won't really care. We didn't really control Panama. We let them do what they wanted to, within reason, and we got control of the canal. The canal zone was pretty much ours, right? So Jimmy Carter kind of unilaterally decides that we need to give that back. And by 1999, they'd assumed full control over the canal. Why? I still don't know. I mean, the people in Panama were pretty happy about it because this is a pretty valuable asset. And they were participating in it, obviously, with workers and some trade and things like that. But they didn't have the real control over it at the time. We did. And many of you will know that there was a pretty good civilian presence in there. There was a military presence. I remember there was a jungle warfare school down there as well. So we were there, okay? And at this point, really, most of Panama is financed by the Panama Canal. I mean, past a certain point. Otherwise, they would be like a lot of these other banana republics down there. And they do have a better economy, and a lot of it comes from the fact they control that trade through there. Now, as you know, and we'll get into this in a second, they didn't do a very good job of running it over time, so they tried to hire that out. Talk about that. Some of you may be thinking, hey, what about that pineapple guy, the general? Yeah, that was General Noriega. And he had assumed control of Panama militarily, a junta as they would call it. He was also a former CIA asset. And we decided that we didn't like him being a dictator in that country, and I also didn't like his kind of threatening about, messing more with the canal. It wasn't handed over completely yet, another 10 years, right? So President George H.W. Bush, surprisingly, decided to remove Noriega because he was also part of a big drug trafficking ring, human rights abuses, of course, but drug trafficking in the United States. You may remember the 80s. We still have a huge drug problem, but at that point, a lot of the drugs were coming from Colombia and South America. And Noriega had been a CIA asset, essentially a double informer down there in his capacity. And now they had assumed control over some of this distribution. And so we'd had enough of that. So we removed him from power. You remember, it was a little interesting. I mean, we sent military down there. He holed up in the Vatican, I think they're in the Vatican embassy there. And eventually he surrendered. A few months later. He was also, remember, this is the time when they were blasting heavy metal music and stuff at the embassy so they couldn't sleep and, trying to drive him crazy. Interesting enough. That was it. He was the last dictator. And they've had civilian control since then. Unfortunately, that didn't solve the problems in Panama. Panama continues to have a lot of problems with economic inequality, as we like to call it these days. In other words, there's a few people that profit a lot off of what's going on, and a lot of people that don't. There are some regional issues between certain regions seeming to be more favored than others. It is the distribution is tough, but it also is relatively stable compared to some of these other countries. Many of you may know that Panama, for a long time, and I'm sure it's still to some extent, was a favorite destination for American retirees. I mean, it started off, obviously, when we controlled the canal zone, because we had a heavy presence down there. And, of course, that carried until 1999 to some extent, although it was gradually transferred over. But they needed hard currency. Our currency is pretty good currency. It is the world standard still, despite what China and Russia are doing. So they welcomed American retirees down there. And if you could be down there for a significant period of time, and you had to show that you were receiving a certain amount of money each month to be able to stay there on this long-term visa. I assume it was a visa. Some of you may know about this better than I. It was a way to transfer funds from the United States to Panama. And your money went, surprisingly, a lot further in Panama City than it did in New York City. So there were a lot of what we might call expatriate Americans down there. I think there still is a number of them. They were granted a lot of privileges there. I remember talking to people who had been down there that if you were older, because almost all of these people that had moved down there were retired from some other, military, some company or something. That's why they were receiving some benefit every month. So they tried to make it very retiree friendly down there. And I was told, that you could get theater tickets in a special line if you were over a certain age and all this kind of thing. So they really tried to make it favorable. I think some of that probably has dried up a little bit, but they still need U.S. money down there. They still need our assistance into the reciprocal trade areas in there. Well, as we know, President Trump would like to get it back because he didn't think President Carter should have turned it over. Me either. And really at the time, if you go back and do some research on that, it's hard to really justify. It's this weird thing with Carter. Remember how he was with the human rights, which is it's a laudable thing. Don't get me wrong. You don't want to do business with tyrants that are abusing their own population unless you have to. But Carter took it kind of a little step further. There were some of these people that we had to deal with in a certain way because they're strategically important to us. Also, and this is also true, you hear it, sometimes it's just a justification, but it is many times true, you had some control over them if they needed you economically or some support in some way, right? So they may still be loopy and doing bad things, but you were able to keep them maybe from doing more bad things. I mean, it's kind of a weak argument, but it is true. So Carter always decided during his human rights campaigns that what he needed to do was, admit we're the bad guy in some way and give back whatever we may have been involved in at the time. And it was more than this, by the way, more than, I don't know, that we did messed up with this here. And I mean, that's all fine and good. If you look at it from a distance, like, oh, great, these people are really very moralistic. Yeah, it doesn't do your country very much good. You have to be kind of hard-nosed in these things. Harry Truman, a Democrat, you may recall, remember his famous saying, and I will paraphrase it a bit for the radio. He said, in discussing some of these dictators that we were working with, he said, yeah, he might be an SOB, but he's our SOB. Kind of sums up the idea, at least until we get to Carter, which is one of the reasons Carter was such a failed president. I mean, I don't think on a personal level he was bad at all. I mean, I couldn't tell, but he didn't seem to be. He had a rather active brother, Billy, as I recall. I think Billy had a beer, I think I read someplace. But, I think that he meant it. But, there's always the person who's evangelical about things. That's all great in certain realms. But it can, in politics and so forth, you have to have some realism thrown in there. And Carter didn't seem to have any of that. I mean, Carter wasn't even crazy about the military, and he had been in the military. He'd been in the Navy. And I remember speaking to military officers who had been in Washington during this time, and there were restrictions on how many days, for instance, if you dealt with the presidency, in and out of the White House, things like that. He didn't want you wearing a uniform every day. He didn't want it to look like the military were really all that involved in the government. So he would request that they only wear the uniforms, 2 or 3 days, I think, something like that, out of the week. That's pretty sad. But that's how he thought. He wanted to be seen differently. Remember, he used to carry his own suitcase, off the plane. Remember, it was like a garment bag he'd carry and stuff, which turned out, as we know, to be empty, because that's not how the president travels. He's got a lot of stuff he's got to take with him, whether he likes it or not. So, packing around a empty briefcase, And I think at his inauguration, if I remember right from reading about this, I think he walked during the inauguration. So he had a lot of this stuff going for him. And really, if we hadn't have had the Watergate system and the way all that turned out, we probably wouldn't have got Carter as president. I think people would have been a little too leery of him. But at this point, they were still upset about the people who were running the Republican Party, and we ended up with Carter. We had Gerald Ford in there for a while, you may recall, who was maybe a 5 and a 1 out of 10 in the presidency, 5.5, something like that. And so this is where we were at. We turned this thing over. How do we get it back? Well, we have a lot of diplomatic pressure, sure. We also have some pretty good economic leverage down there, because part of the economy that they have is run through organizations of which we are a big member. Now, one of the things that we've tried not to do is push them towards other great powers. And as you know from listening to President Trump, that China has been heavily involved in the canal for the last, 15 years, so something like that, running it, because the Panamanians were having trouble running it when they took it over completely. It's a complex system. It needs a lot of, discipline and infrastructure, and a lot of the people in Panama just didn't have that expertise. And the Chinese come along, as they often do, and say, hey, why don't we help you out here? It's altruistic with us. We just want to help. We're just nice people. And before you know it, there's, I think, 2, maybe 3 Chinese companies that were helping run the canal. Now, when President Trump starts talking about this, of course, the left says, well, these aren't the Chinese government. These are independent companies. There's no such thing as an independent company in China. China has a sort of system that's sort of corporativism in the sense that China has a seat at everybody's board of directors, maybe more than one in terms of control. They also have control a lot of the lending, money flows, contracting, especially with the Chinese government, things of that nature. So there's not really dealing with a large Chinese company, and you think you're dealing, oh, well, it's different from the government. No, it's not really. It's just wearing a different suit of clothes, but it's still the Chinese government. So yeah, he's pretty right about that. And as things were going on down there, it became more apparent that things weren't going as well for the United States as we might like. Now there's some back and forth about whether we're being treated fairly or overcharged or things like that to use the canal. And that's a little hard to wrap your head around. I wouldn't be surprised if we weren't. I mean, we get taken advantage of everywhere else. Why wouldn't we take advantage of that? If you want to see where, we got taken advantage of, look at this supplies we sent to Gaza. And some of you remember the floating dock that they were going to build in Gaza for a huge amount of money that didn't work and then eventually was part of it sunk and all sorts of things. You can look that up. That was an interesting thing. That's a Biden thing. And, Biden engineering is a sort of thing. People talk about, German engineering and this and that. Well, think of like precise engineering and then think of 180 degrees on the other side of that. You pretty much got what Biden does whenever they try to build anything. So we could put some economic pressure on them, some diplomatic pressure, but we have to be careful now that we don't push them to say, okay, fine, we're not going to deal with you. We're going to join more closely with the Chinese and their BRICS, which includes Brazil, by the way, group of economic support staff, sort of independence. We don't want that. So we have to balance this out. Militarily, yeah, we take the canal back anytime we want. That's not a problem. Now, if we did, militarily, there's going to be a lot of blowback in the rest of the world. I wonder, would that be like, say, okay, we take the canal back. Does that mean as a little signal to China that they should take Taiwan back? Say, well, look, you took the canal back. We're going to take it. That might be a problem. Some things like that. But we could do it. And we could do it with relatively a very low loss of life. But who wants that? So let's see how that goes. It's an interesting situation.
Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickwagnershow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.